This document was lost, and I didn't know it until I started getting these emails that, hey, this doesn't exist. But I realized the binder that I had was still on my shelf. So it's going to give you its history. It's going to give you all the details, and everything that you see that I've copied that is this type font is coming out of this section of the binder. As example, he does talk about that he uses other oscillators with stochastics, but he makes a really important point that volume is the most important to him. So let's take a look at volume and how you actually work with volume. Is in this case here, I've got a high and relative reference that I've now dropped to a lower volume. So in this area right in here, I've got high volume. When we have a strong key reversal low, we call that pitch iteration. Usually makes a new low. In this case, on the low volume, it doesn't. Here, he's marking his trigger because it went over the trend line. So that's where he's buying. Comes back down, has an area of low volume, and actually would have added to his position there. These bands that you see on his original color charts, he only gave me the two. So all the other charts are his trading charts in black and white. But he said, hey, you can't take the stack. So I found two that seem to have the greatest detail in them. And what you have in these bands are what's called pivot point, which is how he would do price projection. I went down to visit Wasika several times. He truly became my strongest advisor through my career, and I greatly miss him because he would help many traders, you know, when you ran into contract problems, when you ran into, just life problems. He was there. The people that he had put under his wing, he really tried. In many regards, he was a father figure for me because I would go down many times. And in this case, I went down after this article was printed, I think 91, 92. And I said, George, I think I know what these bands are that you never really talked about. They're pivot point. And he said, yes, they are. And we all hate them because the floor never wanted to release this. So Mr. William Greenspan, I suspect, never got a fair fill again from the rest of the floor. But the formula, some people after 91, because that's a long time ago now, have tried to come up with a better mousetrap and have tweaked it and changed it. And I think other articles I've seen, and I've said, no, that's not it. So you've got the original article in this package. But price projection methods that I use for support resistance are Fibonacci, and I use confluent zones. And I'm just using this period to please the introduction of taking Fibonacci and dropping it down to the bottom of the screen is the introduction so that you understand just the basic concept of subdividing 382, 50, and 618. Do not add 25 and 75, remove those. The reason is when you are doing multiples, in this case, look for the strongest bar. I could have used this, but it was a double top, so I came back down. And this is the kind of reaction the market will give you. That's where two different ratios from two different areas, in this case, I've really got 3 Fibonacci. And all I've done is I've lifted this a little bit simply so you can see their multiples that are lined up right on that strong bar. And then I'd swoop down and there's a strong bar and there's the start of a third, and then I'd go down to the bottom. And that's the kind of clarity in terms of support and resistance that you have. So I knew that if S&P dropped here, we're going down to 42.17, which is the start of a rather wide and strong wall of China support area. This is what I use for my own trading. The indicator that I use was stochastics. I will take a look at D-trend. It's not on all of my screens, giving you that for a reference. And I use the composite index. Not going to describe these other oscillators so we don't get off track. But if you want to know more about the composite index, You can download an extensive paper and details off of that website address. Here it explains the 7 period, and your reference is Technical Analysis for the Trading Professional, which is a book recommended, or excuse me, required now for the CFTE exam. Used to be required for CMT, and then they went ahead and put together their own books. But you want to focus on chapter 7. That area of reverse engineering this is the indicator that I actually used. And the reverse engineering is, what was the maximum displacement of the oscillator? In this case, it was up at the top. What price is needed to drive that oscillator up to here? And you often get the extreme of the day. Stochastics, this was set up at 22, 5, and 3. And all I did was set this up with 22, 3, 3. So you can take a look as a comparison, which I'm not recommending, but you can see how loose it is. I'm losing a signal we're about to discuss right here. It just backs and fills all over the place. This is a much cleaner display, which is the one that George would have been looking at. And the Fibonacci, you're going to find that it's now stolen, free PDFs all over the place. You can get Fibonacci analysis right online. You can also get another quick introduction on LinkedIn. Here is an example of the Swedish index that I used. Because I have a subscription report, I tend to use markets that people aren't paying me to analyze, so I don't get them upset. But there's my LinkedIn address, and just go to the activity and you'll see a description of how these projections were actually made, why 2116 and why 2117, which is the confluence zone here and here, are used for price projections. Now, let's take a look at the game plan that George Lane would give us. How his week-long course would unfold is the first week was the material that we discussed in terms of timing and price turning at a support area, which is forming, recognize this is a confluence in the vertical and the horizontal axis. Vertical, of course, being time, horizontal being price. Gann is simply adding the diagonal. So this first concept, although I didn't realize it, that seed was planted in my brain by George Lane. Okay, last rally, take a look, make sure you're on low volume, and so forth. You're going to see all of these tests, and it's not till point 12 that he talks about stochastics. So the guys at night, now, when you think of Waseca, you're thinking actually a little town that's 4 corners that if you blink, you'll drive through quite quickly. And there's only one hotel. I think it's what do you call Hotel 6 or something. And one pub. So everybody after a session in the day would pile into the pub. And I'm hearing these 7 guys are so angry, saying, I came here for a week-long course in stochastics. He hasn't even begun to talk about stochastics. But what he didn't realize is he was telling him how he trades stochastics. And that is true of all traders. We have a game plan and we follow it strictly. In fact, this particular page is what he creates as a notebook, a little notepad beside every single screen that you could check this off and say, yep, I saw that, I saw that, I saw that. So after a day and a half, he gives us an exercise. We go to S&P. And in S&P, we'd have to identify if we saw a setup for a trade, where would we put stops, etc. Constantly, he would hammer through our head, must wait for trigger. In this case, I wrote it in my notes. More than likely, I had a setup, and I said, I found the Holy Grail. And George says, no, you haven't, because you haven't waited for the trigger. And so I'd add it to my note. Here we've got a case where we've got a double bottom. It's not the true double bottom. Here's a triple bottom. This is where I'm saying you got to really study his trading charts carefully. In terms of, here's the double bottom reference as well. This is more traditional on how we teach. Here's a trigger, relative close versus the close on the prior bar. It's well marked, and when you recognize what you're looking for on these little signals, these little circles, there's a depth of information. Here's a trade that I did. I just wanted to demonstrate. This was September 15th. As I'm at this point in the presentation, I look over to my screen and say, hey, I just drew that in the presentation. So I do a trade, it comes back down, test the trend line, and I'm buying with stochastics at 80. I am buying at 80. How can I reinforce any stronger? Stop using 2080 in the wrong way. In this case, when you look over the other oscillators, they also look like they're pretty overdone. But what George says is, in my opinion, stochastics should be used in the following manner. Always know and refer to a chart of the next larger degree, complete with stochastics. So when I add stochastics, it was at the bottom, had divergence, and it gave me permission, plus the volume. I know from this formation here, I've got lower volume. How do I know that? I really recommend to everyone that in his trading charts, you're going to see the traditional histogram plot of a volume or tick volume is not required, because the oscillator, when it diverges, occurs on lower volume. So you begin to read volume with your oscillator. He also taught me, and I didn't know it, to be quite honest, I didn't know it till I started copying all these pages for you, but he planted the seed that stochastics could be used to develop Elliott wave counts. So I'll let you read this because it's pretty advanced, but what it's simply saying is that here I've got a case where a flat is identifying what my wave count is, but what I'll also add, which is not on this section in his notes, is that notice the displacement, the amplitude, is at a high that's over where the break occurred. Often that's a second wave, and this is a fourth wave. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This would be a fourth wave or another second, and the displacement is the same. If it was lower and I was comparing it, and I use 14 period RSI or the composite,